Who is the knight in... Well, I've been thinking about it a lot, maybe a little too much, and I've come to some conclusions about it. Namely that there are 3 strong potential knight candidates, and of those 3, one of them is a lot more likely than the others. But before I can say who those candidates are, I need to state something fairly important about the knight. The knight cannot be both evil and competent. You see, basically, if the knight's goal is to cause the roaring, there's no reason why they shouldn't have done it yet. Because if Ralsei is to be believed, then all you have to do to cause the roaring is to make a dark world inside of another dark world. Which is something that should be very easy to do, it should only take like 20 minutes tops. So it doesn't really seem like their goal is to cause the roaring, it just doesn't really make any sense. So the knight is most likely not evil, or at least they don't have ill intentions. And plus, this is a Toby Fox game. Do you really think we're gonna get a Persona 4-esque villain where one of the townspeople is secretly evil and wants to end the world just cause they're evil? Like, do you really think Toby Fox would write a character like that? And so with that being said, who are the knight candidates? Well, I'm just gonna start with the most likely one, and then cover the other 2 afterwards. So, the most likely person who could be the knight is... Kris. I mean, they literally made a dark fountain right in front of us. And no, I'm not joking. Kris is by far the most likely knight candidate, and has a mountain of evidence supporting them being the knight. Honestly, I would go as far to say that Kris has about a 90% chance of being the knight, and every piece of evidence going against Kris being the knight is built around misunderstandings of how the events of the game actually took place. So I'm just going to list off the most common claims people make for why Kris can't be the knight, and then debunk them as fast as I can. First, Kris can't be the knight because then X Dark World character would recognize them. So this line of thought goes off the idea that the knight physically entered the Dark Worlds and interacted with the Darkners in them, and this is just not necessarily true. We know for a fact that the knight never entered the Cyber Dark World based off of Queen's dialogue where she says she was working based off of assumptions she made based off of the knight's actions. Now, if we know that the Queen never met the knight, but was aware of their existence and their actions, then there is also no reason to believe that the Spade King wasn't also working on assumptions made about the knight. Now, you might try to make the argument that the knight had to be in the Card Kingdom's Dark World because they overthrew the other kings, but in reality, that's not necessarily true. It's very possible that the knight simply manipulated the room before making the Dark World. We know this is possible because we see Kris do just that when making the Chapter 3 fountain at the end of Chapter 2. They manipulated the room by turning on the TV. Obviously, the TV being on is going to have an effect on the Dark World, otherwise there'd be no reason for Kris to turn it on. So there's no reason to believe that the knight didn't just take the 3 king cards out of the deck of cards and then put them inside of an old box of animal crackers before making the Dark Fountain. It's also possible that the knight is just not actually responsible for the kings being imprisoned. None of the lines referring to this event ever say that the knight was the one to imprison them, it just says that a strange knight arrived and then the kings were then imprisoned. It's very possible that the Spade King imprisoned the other kings by himself after the Dark Fountain was made without any influence from the knight outside of the Dark Fountain being made. It's also worth noting that during the Undertale 6th anniversary stream, Toby says that the fountain is what changed the Spade King's behavior. It's also debatable whether or not the knight entering the Dark World and then leaving is even meant to be possible. In Chapter 1, both Ralsei and Lancer claim that the only way to leave is to seal the fountain. If that were the case, there would be no way for the knight to enter the Dark World and leave without sealing it. However, in Chapter 2, you can enter and leave Ralsei's Dark World just fine. Kind of seems like a bit of a plot hole, to be honest. But the point being that it's 100% possible that the knight made the Dark Fountains and none of the Darkners know who they are. The second argument people tend to use is that Kris can't be the knight because they couldn't have made the Cyberworld Dark Fountain. Now, this line of thought comes from the really weird belief some people have that the knight made the Dark Fountain while Noelle and Berdly were already in the computer lab, because that's basically the only way you can argue that Kris couldn't have made the Dark Fountain. And of course, this line of thought immediately falls apart the second you think about it for more than a minute, because this would mean that the knight literally made the Dark Fountain in front of Noelle and Bravely, and both of them just sat there and did nothing. They didn't try to run out of the room when they noticed someone pull out a bladed weapon, or when the room became a light show, or when it started filling with black smoke. There's also more evidence that proves that they were not in the room when the knight made the fountain, and honestly I don't even feel like I should have to explain the evidence, just because of how ridiculous the idea that this is even a possibility is. But I'm going to, just because I keep seeing people bring this up for a reason for why Kris can't be the knight. So as for that evidence, the Queen's recording of the Dark Fountain being made does not have Noelle and Bravely in it. If Noelle and Bravely were in the room when the Dark Fountain was being made, they should show up on the recording. Also, if they were in the room when the knight made the fountain, then they should know who the knight is, and would have told us who the knight is. They of course do not do that, because they don't know who the knight is. It also doesn't line up with when the traffic jam happened. Although we don't know exactly when the traffic jam started, we do know that it had to have happened after the Dark World was made, because Toby Fox, as the annoying dog, did donuts that caused the traffic jam, and then decided to drive into the Dark World. So if the knight made the Dark Fountain when Noelle and Bravely were in the room, then the window of time between making the Dark Fountain and the traffic jam happening would have to be absurdly small. This idea that they were in the room when the Dark World was made just holds no water, but I've seen so many people bend over backwards to try and make this work. Like I had one guy try to argue with me that the reason why Noelle and Bravely didn't run away, or know who the knight is because they were asleep when it happened. Like, they went to the library to do their homework, and then instead of doing that, they both decided to take a nap. You know, as if that's not the dumbest thing ever. And the funniest part of this theory is that the one piece of real evidence they have to argue this point not only doesn't actually hold up after further inspection, but actually ends up being evidence for Kris being the knight. And that piece of evidence is this one line from Ralsei. I felt a dark presence and hurried over. This is Ralsei's excuse for why they knew about the Dark World and why they showed up. How he managed to get over to the library doesn't really matter right now. The point is what this line implies, which is that Ralsei has the power to sense dark worlds and stuff, which becomes a little weird when you think about it. So the logic behind this follows that the Dark World was made after Kris and Susie left to go to the library, but before they got there, because if it was made any sooner, then Ralsei would have told them about it. Because why wouldn't he? He knows how dangerous it is to keep the Dark Worlds up. If he could have sensed the Dark World, he would have told them about it before they left. But we know for a fact that the Dark World could not have been made in that window of time, because the traffic jam had already happened by the time Susie and Kris had left to go to the library. In fact, the only way the fountain could have been made in that time frame would be if Toby Fox, as the annoying dog, made it. But that's not very likely, because that's dumb. And you see, I don't think Ralsei can sense fountains. I think that was a lie. But then why would Ralsei lie about it? Well, I'm gonna go into that later. Because before I do that, I have to explain why Kris is the knight. So like I said before, there's a lot of evidence supporting Kris being the knight, but not all of it is, let's say, of equal quality. So I'm gonna start with the most concrete stuff and then just move on from there. So, the most damning piece of evidence are these two text boxes. It's the TV. Doesn't seem to be even plugged in anymore. This is what it says when you check the TV in Chapter 1, but in Chapter 2, when you check the TV, it says this. It's the TV. Looks like it's plugged in, but it's dusty. So in between Chapters 1 and 2, someone, and that someone being Kris, plugged in the TV. I think it's pretty obvious why Kris plugged the TV in between chapters. It's because they were setting up for the ending of Chapter 2. And so what does this imply? That's right, that the whole thing was planned out in advance. You know, before the Queen explained how dark worlds are made. And it being planned out actually goes even deeper when you look into the other thing that we know for a fact Kris did in between Chapter 1 and 2. That, of course, being Kris eating the pie. You see, if Kris didn't eat the pie, then Susie and Toriel wouldn't have had to make a new one. If they didn't need to make a new one, then Kris wouldn't have had time to slash the tires on Toriel's car, forcing Susie to sleep over. Because if the pie was still there, Susie would have eaten the whole thing in one bite and then Toriel would have driven her home. Because remember, Kris needs Susie to sleep over for the Dark World in Chapter 3. There's also this line with the sink. It's not yet time to wash your hands. This, however, is a little debatable because it seems to be the narrator saying this and not Kris. Unless Kris is meant to be the narrator, which seems possible if Kris is the knight. But yeah, it's a little up in the air. Either way, the point is, Chapter 2's ending was obviously planned out ahead of time by Kris. Also, when Queen is talking about the knight, she remarks that the knight made the Dark Fountain using a knife that just so happens to look just like Kris's. So, if Kris isn't the knight, that means the knight must also have a knife that just so happens to look like Kris's knife. And this is already enough to more or less prove that Kris is the knight, but I'm going to go a little further than just that. So now I'm going to talk about Kris's motivation for making the Dark Fountains, because I'm going to keep it real, I don't have a solid answer for why Kris would want to make the Dark Fountains. I have some ideas for why they might, but nothing concrete. But what I do know is that whatever their end goal in doing all this is, it has to be more important than Bravely's life. Because they make the Dark Fountain in the same way, even in a Snowgrave route. And this is why I feel like Kris has to be the knight. Because if they don't have some master plan, then them making the Dark Fountain at the end of Chapter 2 just makes no sense. Why would they make a Dark Fountain when they know someone is running around town making Dark Fountains, and that multiple Dark Fountains being active at once will cause the end of the world? And it makes even less sense that they would do this after a Snowgrave route. That they would make a Dark Fountain with their mom in the room after seeing Bravely get put on ice. And here's the thing. The ending of Chapter 2 is one of two things. It's either a big red herring, or a big reveal that Kris is the knight. And I feel if it is the latter, the question we're supposed to be asking is not if Kris is the knight, but why is Kris the knight? Because Kris being revealed as the knight early in the game doesn't remove the mystery from the story, it adds new ones. Not just why is Kris the knight, but also how is Kris the knight? And to me, I think that's a lot more interesting of a direction for the story to go in. At least that's how I feel about it. And you know what? I might be wrong about everything. And if I am wrong, then whatever. I'm looking forward to the rest of the game, no matter what happens in it. But I feel like I'm forgetting something. Oh right, I didn't talk about Ralsei, and what Kris being the knight means for Ralsei. But I'm not going to talk about that right now. Nah, you're gonna have to wait for part 2 for that. That's right, I got a lot to say, but I'm not saying it now. So make sure to like and subscribe, because the more you do that, the faster I will make it. Oh, and one more thing. At the start of the video, I said there were 2 other knight candidates. So I'm going to cover them right now really quick. So in case Kris isn't the knight, the other characters it could be are Father Alvin and Noelle's mom. So the logic behind Father Alvin is that he has a strong connection with the first 2 Dark Worlds, the first one being his late father's classroom, and the second one being in the library, which is run by his mother. He's also a new character and not from Undertale, which gives him a chance just because I really don't think any of the Undertale characters are going to be the knight. Just because I have a hard time imagining Toby Fox recontextualizing a character from Undertale to be the main antagonist of a different game. But besides that, Father Alvin doesn't have anything else going for him. It seems that he would be using his father's hammer to make the Dark Fountains, but we know that the knight used a knife, so that doesn't line up. He also just doesn't seem to be that important, just off of the fact that he doesn't have a character portrait or unique voice for his dialogue. And as for Noelle's mom, well, we don't know much about her besides the fact that she's the mayor and that she's a girl boss. But the characters talk about how she knows everything that goes on in town, and the fact that she is a new, important character to Deltarune makes her a possible knight candidate. She is also very likely to be the one to have locked the bunker, which is obviously very important, so we will likely have to get the key from her at some point in the story. So her being an antagonist in the story is pretty likely, even if she isn't the knight. So, yeah, subscribe for part 2.